A group of payday lenders began arguing to the Supreme Court yesterday that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, really one of the few government agencies that gives a crap about us and ensures that we get our money back when we're victims of fraud, is unconstitutional. They essentially want to dismantle it, probably because the CFPB likes to hold payday lenders accountable. Now, they're threatening the existence of this government watchdog that regulates the financial industry. And the case seeks to eviscerate the CFPB and void all of its regulatory decisions. But so far, things aren't going so well for the payday lenders who have brought this case to the Supreme Court, because even with the 6 conservative Supreme Court justices, many of them are real skeptical of the arguments they're making. Now, let's back up a little. Let's learn about what the CFPB does. Since 2010, the CFPB has been charged with basically protecting consumers from predatory financial practices. Just to give you an idea of how successful they've been, since then it has won about $17.5 billion in restitution on behalf of ordinary Americans, and has taken steps to cancel debts for some 200 million eligible Americans. They're putting in work, and they're putting in work on our behalf. We should want to protect this agency. Now, payday lenders who reaped enormous profits from people who need a long or a short-term loan don't like this. They don't like the CFPB, they don't like these regulations, they don't like to be held accountable. Prior to the enactment of CFPB regulations, payday lenders were routinely rolling over the amount due and tacking on fees as often as twice a day, so that borrowers ended up owing thousands of dollars on small loans of $500 or less. Now, when the CFPB came in, they changed all that. In Community Financial Services Association of America, VCFPB, payday lenders zeroed in on the agency's funding mechanism as their argument to dismantle this agency. They wanted to essentially invalidate the agency's rulings that negatively impact the profits of these payday lenders and the predatory practices of these payday lenders. The case is coming before the Supreme Court following a 5th Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that the agency's funding is unconstitutional and all of its regulatory actions are void. Now, if SCOTUS confirms that decision, it would not only overturn the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's laws, but it could also cause a lot of havoc in the financial system, disrupting mortgage and auto loans, just as an example. Now, here's the background you need to know about this case. When Congress created the CFPB, it placed it within the Federal Reserve and stated that it could draw funds of up to $600 million, subject to adjustments for inflation, from the Federal Reserve Treasury, which is raised from payments made by regional reserve banks. In this week's case, the payday lenders argue that Congress's decision to fund the agency with non-annual appropriations raised by the Federal Reserve was unconstitutional under the Constitution's Appropriations Clause and violated the separation of powers. But see, the problem is that the argument flies in the face of, well, a lot of things, including history of funding agencies in a similar way, the text of the Constitution's Appropriations Clause, and also, that pesky little thing called court precedent from the past. Now, the Appropriations Clause does not state that Congress must only fund agencies through annual appropriations or with the funding capped at specific levels. The Biden administration argues that the Appropriations Clause in the Constitution was not meant to straitjacket Congress in how it sets up funding. The clause says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In this case, the government argues Congress enacted a law that funds the agency by providing up to a capped amount each year from the combined fees earned by the Federal Reserve System. At America's founding, Congress created agencies like the Customs Service, the Post Office, and revenue offices, or officers, I should say. And those were all funded through non-annual standing appropriations in a similar way as the CFPB has been funded. Now, Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, representing the agency, argued in its defense, saying that the CFPB appropriations fits squarely within this unbroken line of congressional practice. Noel Francisco, the former Solicitor General under President Donald Trump, of course, and the lawyer for the payday lenders, disagreed. What is he saying? Well, he claims that the appropriations clause contains a hidden requirement that Congress not delegate authority related to funding to the executive branch, which would be a violation of the separation of powers doctrine. The supposed requirement would prohibit Congress providing perpetual funding to an executive branch agency of a non-fixed amount. But as the 3 liberal justices noted, and even conservative justices like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett noted, the appropriations clause contains absolutely no hidden language regarding the separation of powers. In fact, here's Justice Sonia Sotomayor trying to make the case trying to make sense, I should say, of Noel Francisco's argument.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand your argument and I'm a total loss.
I'll try to do that.
Okay, I think I understand it the way Justice Kagan does, but you're telling me it's something different. From the very beginning, Congress gave sometimes a lump sum and said to an agency, you can spend this amount, but didn't do a line by line on what or how much, and the agency would decide how much of that sum it needed. Over 60% of the appropriations, I think it may be 73, 63, something like that, are of standing appropriations. They're not given every year. And some of them are fixed and some of them are not. So I don't understand what you're saying.
Because it's a dumb argument. That's why you're not understanding what he's saying, Justice Sotomayor. Now, Kagan, meanwhile, pointed out that the argument that the appropriations clause limits Congress's authorization of standing appropriations would actually impact many other existing and quite important federal agencies. Let me read you her quotes. It sure seems that in your view, the Federal Reserve would also be unconstitutional. You're flying in the face of 250 years of history. Now look, we expected the liberal justices to shred the argument by the lawyers representing the payday lenders. But I have to be honest, what I was personally surprised by is that even conservative justices like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett don't seem to be buying these ridiculous arguments either. So in her questioning, Barrett made it clear that she was unable to square Francisco's argument with the text of the Constitution. We're all struggling to figure out what's the standard that you would use. There's nothing in the appropriations clause that imposes the limits you're talking about. And then Justice Brett Kavanaugh even challenged the trade group's claims that the Bureau's funding stream exists in perpetuity. Let's watch.
What do you, the word perpetual I'm having trouble with because it implies that it's entrenched and that a future Congress couldn't change it. But Congress could change it tomorrow. And there's nothing perpetual or permanent or about this.
So I think it's entrenched, Your Honor, in the sense that I think maybe the Chief Justice was referring to. Once Congress gives it over to the executive and expands executive power, you've now given a co-equal branch of government a large amount of your power, and you need to claw it back. You can't claw it back through an ordinary law. You can only claw it back through either convincing the president himself to give up presidential power, something you've given to him, which is tough to do, or you've got to override a presidential veto.
If a member or House of Congress tomorrow, if a majority of the House of Congress said we're not going to fund pick your agency unless we change the CFPB funding structure, they could do that. The word perpetual or forever or permanent, I think, is a little strong here.
Indeed. So we don't know how the justices are going to rule on this issue. But dismantling the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau would be absolutely disastrous for ordinary Americans who have been preyed upon by financial institutions. In fact, I just want to read you a quick quote from a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine. The word pandemonium comes to mind in regard to dismantling the CFPB. I want you to jump in on this. I know that was a long explanation and a lot of context in regard to what's happening right now. But in the politics that we're constantly dealing with, right? The corruption that we're constantly dealing with, this agency was a little ray of light.
Yeah, I mean, people got to remember what the inception of this agency was born out of the 2008 financial crisis, where there were many predatory practices by the largest financial institutions in the country, right? And even the Republicans agreed that some of this stuff needed to be reined in, and they needed an enforcement sort of branch within the government to rein these guys in. And again, some of the most predatory practices. What I find hilarious about this payday loan scam is that they don't even want to defend their practices on the merits.
No, they don't.
They're trying to dismantle the CFPB on essentially a technicality.
Totally.
They're not up there saying like, oh, the way that we lend some of our most vulnerable citizens money on a same day basis with incredible interest, incredibly draconian sort of fees on these loans. They're not defending that practice, because again, we have a system of loaning money to people. Most people have decided that it's a fair way to try to make money. You loan people at some type of interest, they pay you back along the way, you get more for the money that you lend and you loaned out. A lot of people say that's a legitimate business. We already have that in place. This is something completely separate from that, and it specifically targets the most desperate people in our society.
Absolutely. So look, let me just say, if you have a credit card or credit cards, read the terms and conditions and read what the interest rate is. Chances are the interest rate on your typical credit card is about 24%. Okay, that is a lot in interest. Payday lenders take that and laugh, like 24%. I mean, their practices are so predatory, and they do prey on the most desperate individuals, that it's nearly impossible for them to ever pay back those small loans. The interest is much higher, and there have been some regulations to kind of rein that in, and those are the very regulations passed down by the CFPB that these payday lenders want to do away with. And you're so right, it's such a good point. They're not doing like a PR blitz defending their business practices, because their business practices are indefensible. Instead, they're using the judicial system, and they're working hard behind the scenes to dismantle the only real protection ordinary Americans received following the 2008 economic collapse. In fact, this was the brainchild of Senator Elizabeth Warren. She really had to pressure Barack Obama to implement the CFPB, and I'm glad that she did. Because when you look at his response to the economic collapse, it was so abysmal. I really do think that it paved the way for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know where I stand on that as an idea. Again, I think people can go out, they can look up some of the cases that the CFPB has won. Wells Fargo being one of the biggest. I mean, these guys are some of the most crooked of all of them. And again, they go in, they audit these folks, and they actually hand down actual penalties. They claw back money for actual normal people. I think what people need to understand too, when we see elite institutions or elites being reprimanded ever, it's only when they commit crimes against other elites, right? For instance, what's happening with Donald Trump in January 6th is like, no, you tried to take the election away from the Democrats, another elite institution. We got to come down on you.
Yeah.
You know, same thing with Watergate. Same thing, like you can't commit crimes on other elites. This is one of the few institutions where elite institutions get in trouble for doing these types of things to ordinary people. It just doesn't happen. You can rarely, if ever, get restitution when an elite institution trespasses against you.
1000%. So we're gonna follow this case. I'm hoping that what we heard from the conservative justices is a sign that they are likely going to rule against the payday lenders. There have been some surprising rulings by the conservative Supreme Court in recent months. So we'll see what happens, but it is important, I believe, to protect the CFPB, and I really do hope that SCOTUS has the best interests of the general public in mind when they pass down their ruling.
Hey, thanks for watching that video. We really appreciate it, guys. And we appreciate it if you become members, because that allows us to be independent, honest, progressive, all the things that you don't get from corporate media. And all of that is because of you guys. Hit the join button below and become one of us, become a Young Turk.